All right, so how many are we right now?
5 of us total. Six, including the 2 of you.
Okay. So let's give a couple of minutes for here. No, I think it's just 2 of us. Yeah, McPherson, who's like supposed to give a summary of things. So there's Steve and.
Let's go.
Not much. How was China? Your trip there?
Busy.
Wow.
I think I was taken out for banquets every night I was there. way too much baiju.
Where were you, Steve?
I was in Beijing. I attended a China Nano conference. Mm-hmm. So I attended the conference, and then I extended the visit 3 or 4 days to do some site visits there in Beijing.
Cool. Did you say site visits or sightseeing?
Site visits. I did not have any free time. Yeah, so I think I visited 5 or 6 institutions while I was there.
Great.
They keep you busy.
Yeah, and just moving around that city is can keep anyone busy.
Yeah. I wouldn't be able to tell you what part of the city I was in.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, but I was like, if you hit 6 or 5 in like a few days, you have you're just like swishing by in the circles.
Yeah.
And it's probably changing. I feel every time I have a friend go there, every suggestion that I have of food is gone and moved, or like new buildings, new neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Hi.
Greetings.
Hello. So there's 7 of us right now. So should we get started soon?
Yeah, and Jamie had to go in for shoulder surgery. So, but I'm glad to see we're recording, so we can send him the recording. They'll be happy.
Okay, sure. So maybe let's start with self-introductions. Let's start with Lisa.
Hi, everyone. I'm in Boston, or in Waltham for people who know Boston. I work with Greener U, which is a consulting firm with energy efficiency and climate change, but I'm here representing myself as a concerned human being today. Next one.
I guess by the order of the screen, so it's us, maybe Chris?
Yeah, so I'm Chris Stokes. I've been an engineer here at Roland for about 20 some years, and I'm sort of engineering support for many different kinds of science, including Ye's science, his research, as well as this endeavor.
And so I'm Ye. I'm a fellow at the Roland Institute. My training has been in several areas, so from molecular biology to structural biology, then later on to chemical physics and experimental physics. And so right now in my lab, we're doing a lot of engineering across the scales to tackle specific problems. So all the way from the single atom and monolayers to apparently trying to tackle a planetary scale problem. Jamen?
Beautiful. Thank you. Great to see you all. Jamen Shively. I have a background going back to my undergraduate and graduate studies of civil and environmental engineering, including hydroclimatology as a graduate student, as well as material science and manufacturing. I've worked in a number of different industries and different capacities as consultant, executive, and so I've got a very broad skill set as regards different industries. I worked for a number of years as corporate strategy manager at Microsoft, so I'm very good at putting together different disparate pieces and coming up with a coherent strategy. I'm also really good at leading movements. I worked with President Vicente Fox of Mexico to lead a movement to legalize cannabis in the hemisphere as a first step towards ending the drug war. And as evidence of my success of that, I've received death threats from criminal drug cartels. So that's, and couldn't be more excited about this and the possibility of putting millions of square miles of this inexpensive, durable, thin film reflective materials over desert and Arctic Ocean to cool the planet. And very grateful to you all. Thank you so much for your leadership, Ye and Guy and all of you. And couldn't be happier to be here.
And Steve?
Yeah, Steve Cranford. I'm the editor of Matter from Cell Press. That's our material science journal. But I guess I'm also representing our repertoire of journals. We have Joule, which is based on energy, scalable solutions for energy, and then also One Earth, which is our earth and environmental science type journal. So we're very interested in all aspects of the science of this kind of project and try to help, I guess, on the promotional side of things, selfishly what we can publish, but also, getting the word out.
Yeah, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, no problem.
And Nolan, can you hear us?
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
My name is Nolan Strait. I spent a few years at the University of Washington, 2.5 of which was spent in the computer science and engineering school there. Been on a hiatus for about 8 months now. I'm in Vancouver, Washington. But I worked in a couple different labs there at the university and have made some pretty significant connections, which I'm hoping to bring those people to the table and get them involved in the conversation here soon, once we all develop a clearer picture of what we're going to do going forward.
And yeah, I want to welcome Michael Gosney, who just joined. Back to you, Ye.
Yeah.
Hi guys, sorry to be late.
No problem. We're just doing self introductions. So since you're here, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, my turn?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Hi guys, I'm here in San Francisco, and I've been working with Jamen and our group on the Radish project for a couple years, but I have a background in publishing and media, and also online collaboration systems, online community and collaboration platforms, and also have a pretty extensive background in the world of sustainable communities, and in particular eco-cities, which is relevant to some of our conversations. So yeah, glad to be here with you all, and looking forward to our exchange here.
Thank you. Guy?
I'm Professor Emeritus of Conservation Biology at the University of Arizona. Somewhere along the way, I became one of the world's leading authorities on the topic of abrupt climate change and consequences for ecosystems and humans. And I'm calling in from New York State, which is where I spend my days these days.
All right, thank you. So I would just briefly go over the goals of this meeting. First of all, we want to discuss whether we have the ability to address climate change given the data and given the constraints that we have on all the different engineering proposals. So whether it's can be addressed using engineering, that's the first question. And then if we come to conclusion maybe, then let's assess whether the particular proposal that we're discussing today, mere reflection, could be one feasible approach. And if so, I think the main objective of this meeting is to determine how we can best promote potential solutions, such as mere reflection. So let's start by having Professor McPherson giving us an update on the facts and basic facts of climate change and what that means for humans.
Okay, I'll start with the McPherson paradox, named by a friend of mine. Industrial civilization, regardless how it is powered, is heating the planet. This conclusion results from the laws of thermodynamics, as pointed out by head of the Atmospheric Sciences program at the University of Utah, Tim Garrett. According to a December 2018 peer-reviewed paper by Burke and colleagues, the rate of heating has us headed for a Pliocene-style climate as early as 2030. This paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences relies upon the IPCC's representative concentration pathways, which have repeatedly proven too conservative when compared to the actual changes. The paper also ignored several dozen self-reinforcing feedback loops, as well as the aerosol masking effect. So this rapid projected rate of change will continue to exceed our ability to successfully adapt or mitigate. The other side of the paradox is that slowing of industrial activity heats the planet even faster than continuing industrial activity through the process of aerosol masking effect, sometimes called global dimming. A paper published in Science by Dana Rosenfeld and colleagues on February 8th of this year, and a subsequent interview with Rosenfeld coincident with the release of the paper, suggests that as little as a 20% reduction in industrial activity will drive a global average temperature rise of 1 degree Celsius within days or weeks. The vast majority of life on Earth cannot keep up with that rate of change. The rate of environmental change currently is outstripping the ability of vertebrates and mammals to keep up based on the conservative peer-reviewed literature with respect to the projected heating in the current century that outstrips the ability of vertebrates to keep up by a factor of 10,000 times. Humans are vertebrate mammals, already losing habitat throughout the world. In addition, Earth is hotter than it has ever been with our species on it. There are a few other ways we know, besides the two sides of the McPherson paradox, to increase the global average temperature very quickly. I know of no way that has been demonstrated to cool the planet, which is why we're presented with such a conundrum. As a result, I suspect that without radical action, we will continue to lose habitat for our species. It's already underway, and as a result, we will go extinct in the near future as a consequence of the loss of habitat. And just a little reminder, the Pliocene, which I mentioned in the first paragraph or so, was about 2.6 to about 5.3 million years ago. The mid-Pliocene was 2 to 3 degrees C warmer than it is today. And beyond 70 degrees latitude, north and south, was 10 to 20 degrees warmer than it is right now. So these are big numbers we're talking about, and therefore the likelihood of an inability to keep up with that rate of change.
Well, thank you for that summary. So, so Lisa, can you just tell us a little bit like what's been done in the public? So what's actively been pursued as ways to deal with impending threats?
Yeah, so I think most of you all know that we address it by climate adaptation or mitigation, and I'm just going to skip the mitigation, go straight to adaptation, which is where the least work has been done. There is resiliency studies, work, and is crisis management. If you look at like the people who are seen to be on the front lines, such as like Harvard, the city of Boston, and the city of Cambridge, they're having plans to address climate crisis events, but they have no actual, and they are starting to develop infrastructure for it. But they're not ready for what is coming, and we are not reducing. That's just adaptation. And data centers across the world are trying to address this also and create critical infrastructure. Key points, nods. But I can share more reports, but it's nothing like enough that is happening. And my field is in higher ed institutions and research institutions, and they're just dealing with crisis and risk management at this point. And then the mitigation, if I should touch a little bit upon that, I don't like Harvard is seen as the leader saying that they're going to be fossil fuel free by 2050 and carbon neutral by 2026. If one of the wealthiest, if the wealthiest higher ed institution in the world can't do it in time, we're facing issues in how we're going to address this issue. And even like looking at like Sweden, where I'm actually from, our both mitigation and adaptation plans are politically aligned with what is feasibly politically in today's world, but it's not actually aligning with the science. Yeah, any questions or clarifications or examples that you all need?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good illustration of what's actually being pursued, and it's obviously not at a rate or scale that's commensurate with the scale of the threat that we're facing.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
yes, Jamie. So the next segment, let's just briefly discuss the different like renewable energy approaches that's been pursued or even bounced around in presidential debates, and let's just briefly consider why are these actual solutions for the crisis we're facing. So, Jamie, you were about to jump in. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no, that's quite all right. I just wanted to ask Lisa a quick question. Lisa, have you found any instances around the world where SRM is actually being implemented, or any other method to actually cool the planet other than the various forms of reducing carbon emissions, which to me seems like a clear losing strategy to cooling the planet in time in the Guy McPherson timeframe?
No, solar radiation management it is in like city, like the issue of like heat island effect that cities such as Boston or Delhi or large scale areas are just trying to like, they are realizing that the heat island effect of all the energy that is being produced within a large mega city is heating the city. So there's like plans of how do you reduce that with like painting things white for like reflection or cooling, or like reusing heating from one center to another. But there is no like actual solar radiation management like wide scale process that people are dealing with beyond just the research and implementation of the heat island effect, to my knowledge. And I'm not an expert in this. I'm a change management consulting dealing with project implementation at client sites. Yeah.
Is anybody here familiar with David Keith's experiment? David Keith, the professor at Harvard, who is going to attempt to do an experiment with solar radiation management, I believe in New Mexico, and I think that was supposed to have already happened, the field trial, but I don't know. I haven't heard anything about it after the fact.
We're aware that he's pursuing that line of research, but we'll go into detail on that particular approach to solar radiation management. But I want to follow up on Lisa's comments. So actually, we know a lot about the effect of increasing albedo for cooling of Earth regionally, mostly from passive observations of cities. So you can just passively observe what's the albedo of this area versus a neighborhood that's a couple miles away. Then there's large-scale studies of that, I think, in the West Coast and in Boston, and the findings are quite striking. For every 0.1 increase in albedo, you have a cooling between 2 and 7 roughly degrees Celsius. It's a huge effect, I think. So another thing we'll come back later is that the MIRROR project is potentially attractive because it can be tested on small scale, because this heat island effect and local albedo cooling has a spatial extent of on the order of mile to 500 meter to a mile radius. Yeah, so it's well established. Yeah. So maybe let's move to Steve quickly. So Steve is an expert in physics, nanomaterials, and also energy materials, because these are important questions these days. So can you give us a perspective on, like, in the academic world, what kind of active research areas are being pursued these days?
I mean, in terms of the materials field right now, energy is the hot topic, and it's basically driving all the research, but it's not so much, there's no large-scale mitigation efforts. It's all about new methods of transforming energy. So new solar cell technologies, new battery storage, energy storage technologies using materials, and that's the bread and butter of what basically we're publishing. But that has no effect on reversing anything. That's only going to change the way we're producing energy and storing the energy. So in terms of the effects on climate and cooling effects, there's basically zero impact. So, I mean, is driving the funding in the field, but there has to be a new tangential direction coming soon, I think. There's some sort of paradigm shift.
And actually, like energy sources like solar and wind are also heating the planet. because you have to have high absorption solar panels to start with if you are striving for high efficiency. So generally, these are much darker than the average soil or ground. So by installing solar panels in desert, for example, we're actually heating the planet. So yes, we're getting energy, but is that what's important, right? The same thing has been found for wind as well, and the effect is quite substantial. There's a recent paper actually from David Keith's group, I think, in Chem. So it's one for the cell family journals that describe the effect. It's quite substantial heating on the order of degree.
Say there's heating from a windmill in operation once when it's been planted there.
Yes, I think. I think there are several mechanisms going on from the way I understand it. One is you're converting kinetic energy in the wind, to partly mechanical in the turbine, and partly also from the friction you generate heat. The other is you're mixing different layers of the atmosphere, and apparently you're bringing down hotter air from above to the ground level. So that's my understanding from somebody who's not in this field. Yes. So let's start to brainstorm a little bit about if we are going to do solar radiation management, for example, or any other technology, what characteristics do we need to look for? So I think now we can bring up this aerosol injection example. So, all the simulations and basic science would indicate indeed that we would cool the planet by doing so. But one major critique of this approach is the termination shock. So what if we're not able to sustain, the millions of flights per year? Then we're not addressing the root cause through this artificial masking effort. So sustainability, once it's implemented, self-sustainability could be one of the characteristics we're looking for example. So, so let's just throw up some, throw some characteristics that you can think of that we should have.
Persistence comes immediately to mind. One of the disadvantages of solar radiation management is that it is quite transient in its effect.
Aerosol version, right?
Right. So using marine cloud brightening, for example, or throwing nuclear bombs into volcanoes. Yes, people have actually proposed all these things. Nuking the desert, all that produces a relatively transient impact. So it would have to be sustained. So I'm thinking about something that is more durable than those sorts of strategies.
So Chris, can you think of some other characteristics you would want in a solution implemented at planetary scale?
Well, I kind of like the thing that's it would be nice if the radiation was with the aerosols. What's beauty is that it's reflected in the upper atmosphere. So that feels like an advantage. I guess it would have to be done with earth abundant materials. That's what I feel like that is a constraint for sure.
Yes. So basically affordability in terms of material constraints that we have.
Yeah.
Jamen?
Hello, and hello, Joachim, who has just joined.
Hi, Joachim.
Joachim. So I wanted to propose another criterion could be that if you do general geoshading, like with aerosols, for example, that has negative impacts on agriculture and other things that depend upon the level of radiation that we have currently. In fact, there was a paper at UC Berkeley some months ago that pointed that out. So I would say, for example, one criterion could be if we could do localized SRM, like with thin film reflective materials, metallized film, over millions of square miles of, say, desert or Arctic Ocean, where we can be very targeted, that would be a desirable criterion, but not necessarily a necessary criterion.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, right? Because if we block out light above the atmosphere, we're negatively impacting primary production of the plants. And another aspect would be tunability. Tunability of these approaches. So people in the aerosol-based approach have been recently looking into creating spatially varying patterns of optical density over the Earth in an effort to, say, selectively cool parts and others in order to tune, hydrological cycles in a favorable direction for agriculture, for example. So spatial tunability will be a key, and that's something we will be addressing as well.
I don't know if this is relevant, but whatever is going to do the masking or like be the reflected needs to not in the production be cost efficient, but also not produce more greenhouse gases. So it needs to be self-sustaining, low impact, which to me seems to be a huge issue of the scale they were looking at of reflection and area. Whatever you produce needs to both be lasting and not consume a bunch of resources in the production.
Yes, that's falls into the idea of Chris of constraint on materials, earth-abundant materials. Of course, there's a constraint on energy needed to process these base materials into the finished product. Yeah, so basically, it's again in the category of affordability. Yeah. It has to be affordable in energy terms.
It feels like it needs to be durable. We got to like the aerosol version was it's you're guy you're saying it's a weeks long effect per.
It depends on at what level in the atmosphere that you inject them.
Yep.
At the lower troposphere, it's probably weeks or days.
Yeah.
Where they propose to inject in upper parts, it's probably on the order of a year. But that's still fleeting on the time scale of that we're trying to deal with.
Yeah, so I feel like 5-year durability, something like that, is I think this is the time frame that it feels like is minimal.
Yeah, probably 5 years to decades, ideally decades to century, right? 50 years, let's say, would be a good.
As long as it's tunable, yeah.
As long as it's tunable, yes. And quickly tunable.
Yeah.
All right, so we mentioned affordability, durability, and lack of additional toxic emissions, for example. Yeah, and I'd like to add a couple more. I think probably testable on small scale would be a huge plus for just reassure the public. So that's why mirrors can be useful, because everybody have them in their house, and just putting them on the roof in say Middle Eastern countries or areas that are overheating would immediately improve comfort. So it's something people can very quickly accept. That's in stark contrast to injection of nanoparticles into the atmosphere, especially given perhaps uninformed concern of some citizens about governments injecting stuff into the atmosphere. But saying that the Mirror project wouldn't have this issue to worry about, because it's testable on small scale. And we also touched on the issue of the tunability. Basically, a spatial pattern of deployment can be used to tune local climates. And in combination with most advanced climate models and climate modelers, one can basically custom design different patterns of rainfall and temperature gradients. So that's very important. And aerosol masking has limited tunability because of the fast mixing in the jet streams, etc. All right.
Or a high degree of unpredictability, I think, as well in the jet streams. Yeah.
So where are we on the list of things to discuss? So, all right. So, it seems like I'm next for just giving an overview of how I came to this understand this project, or how I came up with these ideas. So basically, when I, years ago, and nowadays still, when you turn on the news, there's this debate about cutting emissions or keeping the economy going. So when we demand reduction of emissions, it's almost in the public, there is and people are mixing two concepts. So we are demonizing CO2 as if carbon dioxide is synonymous to temperature increase, and that in order to decrease temperature, cutting emissions is the only way to go. And of course, that's a very difficult endeavor because of the need to produce energy and because of other political reasons or financial reasons. So by constraining ourselves to this unilinear tug of war against corporate forces, it's basically a lost battle. So instead of equating temperature increase to CO2 increase, let's plot a situation on 2D plane where the axes are CO2 concentration on the one axis and temperature on the other. So right now we are indeed following a straight line in that 2D plane. But why are we following that straight line? The shape of that line is dictated by the structure of the Earth, including its albedo characteristics. Let's say for some reason we were able to transform the Earth into just covered by snow, we would have shifted that line downwards in the 2D plane, right? So we need to break away from this linear thinking and expand our thinking into this 2 dimensions at least. Humans, we should at least be able to handle 2 dimensions. Now that we have this 2D plane at our disposal, let's think about where on that 2D plane we want to go. So the 2 axes are CO2 concentration on the horizontal axis and temperature on the vertical axis, let's say. CO2 concentration, actually, we do not want to go to 0 because that's synonymous to killing all the plants, right? Existing data shows that plants need at least on the order of 30 ppm to survive at lower temperatures. As temperature of the environment increases, their demand for energy also increases, and thereby they need more CO2. So they can need up to 100 or even more to basically just stay a constant weight. So we have a lower bound for CO2. What about the other end, the higher end? So well, that depends on the time scale we're talking about, right? If you put a human into a gas chamber, if you turn on like a couple percent, it's probably gonna kill the guy or the lady in hours. And negative effects in humans are observed at as low as around 1,000 ppm. So plants can tolerate a bit higher, but animals, especially the ones in ocean, can barely manage concentrations above 1,000 when it's dissolved and transformed into acidification units. So we know that the window in this 2D plane for the CO2 axis is between roughly 100 to 1,000. So we have roughly 1 order of magnitude of range to work with. And the other axis, the temperature axis, is actually more stringent. It's not really of course, the mean temperature that matters. It's actually the extreme events that manage to kill off a whole population within hours or days of exposure. And if we look at how the extremes of temperature are evolving with average increase in temperature, you'll find that the extremes increase more than the average is increasing. And of course, the lower extreme, the colder temperatures are actually getting less severe. So we have less cold spells on average. but the distribution is skewed toward higher temperature extremes. And temperature is a universal killer of life, high temperatures. If we plot out the performance of different organisms as a function of temperature, you will find some sort of a bell shape, right? It's intuitive. If you freeze stuff, they die. If you boil them, fry them, they die. And somewhere in the middle where we live, depending on the environment of where each organism lives, there is the optimal temperature that it prefers. And generally, this bell curve is also not symmetric. It has a very hard cutoff at the high temperature end. And basically, on Earth right now, we're already beating against this higher end, as manifested by widespread mass local extinctions of communities and reduction in fishery outputs and decrease in farm outputs, agricultural outputs. So analysis of this situation in this 2D plane tells us any solution needs to be able to bring us first and foremost down in temperature. But of course, very importantly, we can also not go beyond roughly on the order of 800 to 1,000 ppm in CO2. So any solution has to be able to move us in vector terminology, negative in temperature, and also has the potential to move us in the negative direction in CO2, or vice versa, to have the tunability of the full range. Because perhaps in the short term, it might be necessary to increase plant production. Let's say if we were to go into a vegan diet, then we want to grow plants more faster, then it's probably preferable to stay at 400 or 500 ppm, 600 even, because that's 700 is roughly where the benefits of CO2 fertilization levels out, plateaus. So between now and a couple hundred ppm more, we are still gaining a little bit in primary production. Yeah, so those are a conceptual understanding that I currently have for the situation. And
I should point out that nutrient content declines at higher levels of carbon dioxide.
That's yes, so the nitrogen content decreases.
What is gained in productivity could easily be lost in nutrient content. So yes. I don't think we understand that story particularly well, but it's something to keep in mind in any event.
Yes. Yeah, so that's also documented in nature, this nutrient deficiency. So there are different species of small fish, and this, I think the southern variants of these tiny fish are poorer in nutrients. The northern are more rich in nutrients. And with climate change and this population migration, the southern fish went into the northern regions, and the birds that eat these fish cannot distinguish between them. So they ate more of the nutrient-poor fish, which filled their stomachs, and thereby deprived them of energy and killed off whole populations of birds. The decrease in nutrient quality. So exactly. So the tolerance for CO2 is what I would call a secondary effect. It's not going to kill you quickly on the order of hours to days, probably over generations. But it's a time scale that we can work with and gives us a buffer of time to go in the other direction, back to the original starting point of 300 ppm. All right, so any other comments and questions?
I love your framework. Yay. It's brilliant. It's refreshing because it breaks us out of the linear thinking of the only way to address planetary overheating is through greenhouse gases. And so thank you for decoupling.
Yeah, can you just, has everyone seen a chart of that? Because I feel like it's a little bit confusing to say, to articulate.
I haven't made a presentable chart of that.
Well, okay.
Chris,
it's annoying to hear an articulation of it, but I feel like it's before you leave the subject, I'm sorry to.
Okay.
I'm sorry to. Yeah, just to it helps to see it. So he's just saying that basically. Have you guys ever seen the charts that show gross domestic product versus CO2 consumption? So there's this is not Ye's chart, but this is a different chart where.
Let me turn on the.
Chris, we cannot. There's no way we're going to see that drawing. Is there any chance you can?
David's trying, but
draw on it.
How about that? Is this any better?
Nope, it's not gonna. I'm pretty sure it's too far away.
Probably I need to move the thing to the camera.
Yeah. All right. Let me just.
Can't you just share your screen and draw on the screen?
Conceivably.
We like old school stuff here.
Hang on. If you swing it this way, is that how's that?
better.
Just these two.
Yeah, there you go.
Now we're getting there.
Sorry about that. Okay. So anyway, so there's a great chart of basically on I think it's the energy it's on the it's a US site. I'll circulate it to you, but basically it goes GDP and then CO2, and it's like this. Everybody is on the same damn chart, and so gross domestic for everyone, CO2 the CO2 production or energy consumption is on the same chart. Ye is talking about, we still have this. Ye is talking about CO2's on the Y.
CO2 on the X.
CO2. So CO2 and then temperature. And then there's this same linear chart. So the only group that has gone off of this GDP versus CO2 production is like Costa Rica has like a GDP that is very high and a very low CO2 production. But everybody else, all the other countries on the planet are on the same chart. So now the thing is, can we get off the same CO2 chart? Because the whole concept in here, everybody's welfare is perceived to be dependent on energy production, and it's tied to the CO2. I think this is the point that I feel like is.
Yes, I will just maybe for the record add a few things to here. So basically, lower CO2 requirement for the plant gives us a cutoff. Well, cutoff like that.
If you jump to the right, here, that the thing's going right through your head. Start.
Oh, like this.
Yeah.
All right. So that's a minimal requirement for the plant, and that's so that's me putting some units here. That's probably 100. That's 1,000 ppm. And that's basically negative physiological effects. And the allowable region would be roughly in this area, right? And the problem with an approach such as artificial aerosol injection is that indeed it would allow us to go down in here in trajectory, but it always has a positive component for CO2 emissions because the economy and everything is still powered by burning fossil fuels. So the vector for is going that way. What we need is a vector component for CO2 that can go this way.
That's the space off the line, but basically that's the two-dimensional space that he's projecting.
So basically, any approach or large-scale project we undertake also needs to give us the capability to start to do this. Maybe we can go back to the
yeah.
Where was this?
Sorry, distracted.
No problem. All right, so maybe we can now talk about some specific ideas of how to implement mirrors and what that means in terms of material and energy costs, and what implications that has for our future energy production and environmental remediation, ecosystem remediation. So let's see if we can share a screen with you guys. Where is it? Where was that scene? Here. Ah, here. Let's see. Share screen. Oh, no, you want to share? Yeah, you got it. Do you guys see this?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Thank you.
Okay, so it's more or less my artistic rendition of one example of how we could implement mirrors, and it's arrays of floating circular mirrors, in this case, in a hexagonal lattice. So we have chosen this example of ocean implementation because of several factors. One is that's where the most surface area on Earth is found, and ocean is darker than land on average. So by putting reflectors there, per unit area of implementation, we gain 50-60% more energy rejection back into space. And so in this particular example, you're seeing these bright circles. They could be like, mirrors that's 1 meter to a few meters in diameter, and they would be floating and tied together using a network of tensioned ultra-strong fibers, so that they're constrained from crashing and moving too much and crashing into each other. And you see also at the vertex of these smaller arrays, there are these taller posts. It's just one idea I had of larger floating glass structures that then individually anchor these smaller arrays together. And in this implementation, I also drew in some solar panels on top of these pillars. So the idea is that when you implement something, for example, like this in the sea, you can imagine the occurrence of waves and hurricanes coming your way. And it's probably not a very good idea to allow these fragile structures to confront hurricanes and huge waves. So one potential solution is that we have these pillars being actuators that can drag the arrays down underwater. And this can, in principle, be done fairly easily using simple principles. So if you had cavities in these pillars that can be reversibly filled with water or evacuated using air or gas, then you can tune the buoyancy of these pillars. And when the pillars go down, then they will drag the nearest neighbor mirrors and also drag the whole thing down. So, and if you want to bring them back up again after a storm, there are also many different ways to implement in practice. But one way could be during operation, you have the solar panels there collecting some energy and stored in a battery that's enclosed inside the structure. And when you're ready to come out of water, you use that battery to run, say, electrolysis of water to create hydrogen, oxygen. You just reject, throw away the hydrogen, or maybe store them for a fuel cell. But you can use the oxygen component to displace water from the floating chambers and then initiate the resurfacing. So that's just another array, same idea, just a square array instead of hexagonal. So there's pros and cons for each depending on what's limiting. Hexagonal has a better packing efficiency for the same intramirror distance, but the square array will require a bit less cabling for the constraining. And for example, one idea for these floating mirrors could be as follows. So here's a perspective view from top. So it's a stem, which is semi-hollow, sealed off at the end to give the weight to keep the orientation when floated. And then you have a open chamber. And on top of which is a membrane that can, for example, have two stable configurations by buckling mechanics. So if you, in the fabrication, we can slightly pressurize and before we flame seal, then the configuration when it's emerged from water would be slightly convex. And maybe when we drag them down into water by a couple of meters, there would be enough pressure from the water to overcome that initial slight pressure and make the whole thing go concave. And obviously, one could induce a slight volume change that translates into a slight bistability of the effective density. And that would make it much easier to sink larger arrays when you have smaller individual energy heels to overcome, rather than if everything stayed really buoyant, then the stress in the whole network would be too much for any cable to handle. So that's one specific example of achieving the primary objective of cooling the planet. And but concurrent to efforts such as these, we would have developed a very good technology or expertise in glass and the mirror manufacturing. So for example, do you have the empty ones not evaporated? Let me turn on the light. So these are decorative, just glass bubbles that I bought from like Crate and Barrel for like a couple of dollars each. So they're hollow, very thin walls. One can very easily coat these into spheres, into mirrors.
If you come closer to the actual, there you go. Thank you.
So it's not coated on this side. There's a little hole through which we can deposit the metal, for example. Then the top end becomes air.
So the outside of the glass is still just plain glass, and then the inside of it is tens, hundreds of nanometers of.
Yeah, it's roughly 100 nanometers of aluminum. So this way of manufacturing mirrors can be done on large scale, and the general not the specific shape, but the topology, where the reflector metal is protected on the inside of a very etch-resistant material like a glass, would basically ensure that as long as the glass is not broken, the mirror would be indefinitely stable. So that goes into the durability aspect of mirrors as the reflector, rather than, for example, polymer-based reflectors, because those decay on the order of single-digit years under strong solar radiation and weathering. So at the same time that we were to undertake such large project, we would have developed the expertise to make large arrays of different kinds of mirrors. For example, just the flat mirrors that we make routinely from float glass. We can use these as primary solar light collectors to power solar thermal energy plants, which are by far the most efficient renewable energy technology that's demonstrated on large scale industrially. It's about 40% efficient, much better than any silicon or upcoming perovskites or whatever photovoltaic. So the mirror project, therefore, can both allow us to go down on the temperature axis, but also go to the negative direction on the CO2 axis, or at least stay there where we already are, because we could transition global energy usage to 100% solar thermal electricity So if one does a back of envelope calculation, you only need about 2 to 3% of the total mirrors produced for a cooling effect to power the whole world, for the satisfy the energy demand. So instantaneous transition to 100% renewable is just a corollary, a side effect of this more immediate need to contain temperature increase.
Beautiful.
Is there any documentation or presentations of the project, Ye, that would be available to us to review?
I think this is the most formal presentation that I have done so far.
Gotcha. Well, it's very compelling. It's worth expressing to a broader circle.
So there's I want to expand on those ideas. So satisfying the energy demand will allow us to stay stationary on the CO2 axis. But of course, one can use other methods to complement this to achieve a biological drawdown, for example. However, there's a better way to use solar thermal energy. So one can just take calcium carbonate and shine mirrors onto a furnace containing calcium carbonate to make calcium oxide, CaO. That thing dissolves very quickly in seawater, and you can sprinkle the powder sparingly, as you know, during like ocean transport by these ships, and that thing will neutralize CO2 that's already in the ocean. And that's one way how we can use basically the same setup, the mirrors, to produce lime and do ocean liming to do drawdown that way, which would also have a more direct benefit for ocean creatures such as certain species of cods that are particularly vulnerable to ocean acidification, and that's also important fishery species for much of the world. So, so in principle, the mirrors can be used to also move in the negative CO2 axis. So Joachim, do you have a microphone or no? Apparently, the mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? So could you explain how you dump the CO2 that gets freed when you bake the calcium carbonate to produce the lime?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So this would have to be done in conjunction with CO2 storage technologies. Yeah, so that's something to be developed. Yeah.
Okay.
But of course, we can also just rely on the slow process of biological processes. If, say, we can tolerate 500-600 ppm concentrations for in the medium term.
Mm.
So that's just the one possibility. It's not a requirement for this to work.
Okay.
So Guy, so you have probably some of the most realistic view of what's going on in the world these days, and you're also very vocal about the conclusions that you have come to. And I think I'm in very much agreement with most of the conclusions, provided that there's if nobody cares to implement an engineering effort like that. So what are your assessments of the ideas that we have discussed so far today?
Let's get rolling. Seriously. I mean, Michael had a good point. We need to take this to a broader audience, obviously, because the 8 or 10 of us on this call are not going to fix anything at scale.
Yeah.
And time is very short. You know, the impending economic deflationary event that could happen as early as this fall is a serious matter with respect to the aerosol masking effect, or the alleviation of the aerosol masking effect. So, you know, I have been vocal, you're right, and I've never suggested that we give up on the whole proposition, including the human race. So I'm a fan. I don't know where to go next. Maybe people on this call can point us in the direction. How can we get Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and everybody except Donald Trump and the Trump administration involved, and so on?
Well, actually, I'm not so sure about that, because I don't think it's productive, as we mentioned, to go really against fossil fuel industry and usage. I think there's value in getting these guys involved as well, because fabrication of mirrors and building new plants will obviously use a lot of energy. Well, solar thermal energy can be used, but the kinetics, the speed at which we can deploy that to scale is not realistic, given the kinetics of ecosystem collapse that we're facing. So I think there's a point to be made that perhaps some kind of deal with the fossil fuel industry, that the government sponsor your industry. Let's increase burning of fossil fuel for 30% a year for the next 10 years, but in exchange, you also fund fundamental research in solar thermal energy and its deployment, and methods to do ecosystem remediation. And for the next 10 years, yes, you can have this privilege, but then you have to give something in return, and we gradually phase, basically swing the ball around to a more sustainable way of energy production.
Guys, everyone, I need to leave soon, but I wanted to say that, sure, Jay, but I think that's like a premature, that's like form over function. And I think the language around the function needs to come out first. And I'm thinking about like practical steps that needs to be taken to take this on a next level is a very clear narrative and the scientific like solidness of it, to that be like in a clear presentation with clear data and resources and a journal presentation. And then I think how the actual implementation will shape up, that we can argue until the end, and we won't know until we're in the action phase. So my suggestion is like something that I think we missed today, maybe because everyone is on the same page, but I think for sharing this with others is the fact that like even if we reduce carbon and emissions with every goals that everyone has, we're going to still have an increase in temperature, and temperature is the most important thing. Boom, all the facts around that. And then say, how do we control temperature while we slowly are reducing our CO2 emissions? And then suggesting method for that. And I think don't have like the superhero syndrome and say like we have the only solution. But I think even this narrative isn't there. People don't understand. Everyone is still talking about we just need to cut CO2 and reduce the heat island effect. So if we don't get that story across, that that's not enough, and don't panic about that as much as panic about temperature right now. And then here's a suggestion that we have for doing so. If you have a better one, if you have like a better way of doing it, we don't have to be super heroes. We just want to be humans on this planet. So for me, the next steps before I jump off, and then you can throw my idea into the trash bin and move on. But that would be to really get the solid understanding of why super clear. Right now we have had a lot of how and what, but we need a how narrative there with the scientific background. And I'm jumping off, so I won't hear all of your critiques, but I'm looking forward to listen to the recording afterwards and have you all trash my idea. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and keep on talking. Bye.
Thank you,
Lisa.
Those were great ideas. Peanut gallery.
So, Steve, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it has to be fleshed out more, like I said, in a formal presentation, which is where CellPress could hopefully help. I don't know exactly where you want to go with it in terms of, you know, perspective paper, whatever. But we can. It can be it can be a string of papers. Piecing this together however you want. Once you have kind of the science, kind of a foundation there, an anchor. I mean, I think the idea is to start spreading that with you presenting it to a bigger audience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and cite us accordingly.
Yes, that's my next task. It's just because the issue is so vast, I've been like little like delving into the different individual areas. So so next step would be like to synthesize everything and then distill out the essence and present it to hopefully CellPress for a broader release.
Do you have, it's Michael Gosney, sorry. Do you have some support there at the university to get behind, you know, some more formal presentation of these ideas? And again, I think in terms even of publishing both books and video presentations, I mean, it's really important, a big idea like this, even if all the science is not totally worked out, I think that's really the point in getting the big idea out in the world more, is to engage more perspectives and get the science dialed on it. But I think sooner than later, given the you know situation right now, it's a good idea to really work on creating some more sophisticated presentations and distributing them.
Yes, Jamin?
Yeah, I second Michael's thoughts and also Lisa's. And I think that a presentation could begin with Ye, you, and Guy McPherson. Guy McPherson does the most compelling presentation and overall synthesis of the overheating, the urgency, the emergency, etc. So we need that at the beginning. That sets the stage. And then the question, so how do we cool the planet in time? You know, and then a little bit on, look, reducing greenhouse gases is good, but we kind of missed our window to really do that effectively back in 1975. And, you know, a few years have passed and a lot of CO2 and methane have been released since then. So now we've got to do the mirroring thing. And I would also add, I love your solution. It's really elegant, really beautiful. Let's also consider thin film reflective materials. And yes, this has a polymer back and maybe about literally 10 aluminum atoms thick of aluminum, which is enough to create the reflectivity. It's also enough to protect the plastic. You made a very good point that the polymers degrade, especially with light, not when they're covered with aluminum, and we can hit them with aluminum on the top and the bottom, right? And it's very little aluminum. 10 atoms thick is a vanishingly small quantity of aluminum, so it'd be very cheap. And then we could also combine the thin film arrays to doing solar thermal, okay? Now, I would suggest it might be more feasible to start in the desert on land, just because it'll be cheaper and easier to roll out millions of square miles of this stuff on the desert, but also building on your sort of holistic approach, where you say, hey, how can we also generate energy? Solar thermal, super efficient, as you pointed out. I didn't know it was the most efficient. That's really good news, because we can also do this concentration of sunlight using thin film to generate the solar thermal. But also consider that as we roll out hundreds of thousands of square miles of this stuff in the desert, there's also the potential to then capture the rainwater. Of course, it rains very little in the desert, but very little times 1,000,000 square miles is a lot. So we can capture that rainwater, use it for agriculture, use it for all kinds of uses. And then also creating a whole bunch of shaded area in the desert suddenly creates an oasis in the desert where lots of things are possible. I point to Michael Gosney, who is one of the pioneers going back literally decades in the concept of arcology, and that's architecture meets ecology, and creating whole new human habitation spaces in desert regions, among others. So if we look at the real estate potential, the energy generation potential, the water accumulation potential, all of those adding on top of the cooling, and then suddenly we might be able to create a very beautiful self-sustaining, especially if you consider the real estate, the water, the agriculture, it could actually become profitable, as well as the energy generation, of course, so solar thermal. So I think there's a huge opportunity to create a story. And of course, just ask Steve, what the world most wants is a story, right? If we can create a story that starts with the urgency, we bring in Guy McPherson, and then everyone's like, oh my God, we're all gonna die. And then Ye boots Guy off the stage and says, no, we have a solution. And here it is in general terms. And then we flesh it out. We could start in the desert where it's easy and cheap and we generate power and water and all this good stuff. And then once we've kind of mastered the technologies there, then move the party to the ocean, because then we'll also have the funding, the money to do that. But it all starts with the story. So I think there's a huge opportunity for all of us to work together, create this story, and then push it out to the world with a big press conference. You can imagine leveraging the extremely strong brand of Harvard. Imagine a story that leads with Harvard scientists propose a bold plan to cool the planet by 2021. Everyone's talking 2030, 2050. With this stuff, we can cool it by 2021, which, back to Guy McPherson, is roughly the time frame within which we need to cool the planet. Otherwise, we're really going down the tubes. Going on mute. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. I think I agree that deployment of mirrors in the deserts will be one part of the process. But I have to caution several things about polymer-based materials. One is, even though it's very thin, but if you count all the square area, stack them up together, it's a huge quantity of organic material derived from petroleum. The price and energy production of that is, I haven't done the calculations but rigorously, but from initial estimates, it's actually more prohibitive than glass-based approach. So that's one. The other is a potential pushback from the public, who is already arguably unjustifiably concerned with the plastic pollution. So there could be political resistance there using a plastic, but those are all details. But
there would be resistance, absolutely. There would be, but there's also advanced glass technologies, right? Just as evidenced by the iPhone. Yes. That seems like a very promising solution.
Yes, exactly. So the flexible glass, especially developed by Corning, could be, for example, the material that we use for these floaters that has this bistable states, or even perhaps whole arrays of them that are collision resistant. But that's off the topic. But I want to come back to this question of implementation in desert. So there's some problems with that, especially in combination with the rainfall, because calculations and simulations generally agree that implementation in desert will decrease rainfall in the desert slightly, but measurably. And there's not much rain to start with. And the amount that you can reasonably collect is probably not worth the effort. It's probably better to use the energy to do desalination in specialized plants, rather just concentrate, the production of things you need in specialized facilities, and devote the cheapest, simplest reflectors to do what they do best, just reflecting light. But of course, having a nice stories and narrative around is good, but we also need to be aware of what's known about climate science and the effect of albedo increase in the deserts. So that's, well, of course, cool, and that's of primary concern, but the secondary effect is a precipitation decrease, which we might want to also consider. So in terms of steps in actual implementation, I think local mitigation of urban heat island effect could be what we use to convince the public. But at the same time, it's imperative that we develop this ocean-based technology, because that's where we'll have the most flexibility, most durability, and most tunability of our climate, if you will, once we have the platforms in place. So something that could be helpful for us. So Michael mentioned this presentation opportunities. So it's climate science and engineering is not my field until like maybe a year ago when I got interested and looked into it. So I'm only starting to go to conferences. Actually, next week will be my first one. It's organized by Penn State, the Drawdown Conference. And I had a lot of resistance from the organizers in trying to get a talk into that conference because it's very much in opposition to the narrative of the drawdown, where you can do incremental small changes and planting trees, educating girls, etc., to solve this thing. So there's a dissonance in perception there, but it's something we're starting to pursue. And also the American Physical Society will have a meeting at Roland, monthly meeting for the Boston chapter starting next month. So I'll give a talk, inaugural talk there, and I'll probably discuss this topic. So, but I think the next urgent thing after this the next weeks would be to get a presentable academic style paper, fully referenced and supported by data to Steve. I think that's the next big thing that's on my plate. And like you guys, Jamen, you have connections to potential funders. I think getting the ball rolling on demonstrating these glass-based reflectors, their production, their producibility on mass scale, that's also very important and needs to happen concurrently with the getting the story ready. And today I went to MIT, actually talked to the director of the glass lab, just getting his input on whether this bistable membrane could work. And he gave me very encouraging answers because he made glass-based instruments, some of which have membranes that vibrate and have this degree of flexibility. So it's something that's possible. And I'm actually meeting him and some of his colleagues from Corning again later this week on Friday to discuss specifics of potential ways to make these floaters. But all of this will take time and finances. And my position here, I'm not paid to do this. So it's like a weekend and the nights hobby project. So if you guys could, muster up funding and support for this, that would be very helpful.
All right. Well, it sounds like there's a golden opportunity to put together a big holistic plan where we can all contribute in the different ways in which, some of us are, for example, Michael Gosney is very, very skilled at writing, as I'm sure Steve is as well. I think if we can create kind of like an environment, whether it's Google Docs or whether it's Slack, but some sort of environment where we can all collaborate online. And also, I think it's important for us to continue to meet using this forum and even identify what other skill sets are needed that we can bring in, what other specialties, because especially when we look at this as a big holistic opportunity, I think, there's so many different facets to it. And in fact, one of the areas that Michael Gosney, Nolan Straight, and I are working on our kind of our daily bread and butter is a platform for collective intelligence. And thanks to technologies such as video conferencing, which can be recorded, and automatic transcription of what is spoken, we have an opportunity to actually create a collective intelligence around the SRM opportunity specifically. Because as far as we're concerned, I think it's fair to speak for all of us here, there is nothing more urgent than cooling our planet. We are literally staring death in the face. And so there's going to be tremendous incentive to bring together the disparate groups. There's different collective intelligence groups in the world. This can be the thing to bring them all together. There's different SRM groups and research going on around the world. Even if they're going off in a totally different direction, which we think is the wrong one, they still have talents, skills, knowledge, and networks that we can benefit from. Exactly.
So there's a lot of like solar energy research also in Switzerland, where Joachim is located in the Paul Scherrer Institute. But I think their funding unfortunately got cut in 2017 or 18. But they did beautiful work demonstrating how you can make glass using solar power only, and also make concrete using solar power. So many of current industrial processes can totally be replaced by directly using solar thermal power, not even skipping the electricity conversion step. So a lot of groundwork has already been done. Now it's a golden time to just bring everything together into one holistic picture and identify the clear path to tackle this thing.
Very exciting.
Yeah. All right. Nolan, you had a comment? I thought that Nolan was going to say something.
Oh, I mean, I'll take the opportunity to say that my particular focus is definitely more on the collective intelligence side of things. But considering what Guy McPherson has to say and what Jamen has expressed to me, there's a lot to be done, and a huge push we have to make for SRM and cooling the planet. And I'm super excited at the potential to basically use the group of people we have now and those that are not in this meeting but are close to all of us to essentially form a community that sets a precedent for collective intelligence on the planet and effectively becomes a group role model, so to speak, for the rest of the world, where governments and corporations are not necessarily pulling the weight that so many people are expecting them to pull and kind of waiting for them to pull. And I think that a community like the one that we're beginning to form now and expand now is going to be incredibly motivating to so many people. And I'm very excited about that.
Mm. All right. I think thank you all for taking the time, and thanks for Jamen for reaching out and asking for this opportunity to share ideas. So I was just focused on ironing out the specifics of the science and engineering details, and also preparing a presentable form. So it's so still early in the writing process, but I think it's there's value in pursuing multiple things in parallel because of the urgency of this situation. Yes, Jamen.
And yeah, if I may add just a couple final thoughts. So you're absolutely correct in starting with the science and the technology as the starting point for this, because we need that solid foundation. But just imagine that as in parallel, we build out the story, the technical paper, et cetera, that appropriately summarizes the science and the technology. Imagine that in parallel, we're working on media solutions, which is something that Steve Cranford and Michael Gosney, for example, could help spearhead. And then in parallel, government solutions, which is something I'll volunteer to spearhead because I've had plenty of interaction with government. We can also have private sector initiatives where we proactively invite in, and I applaud you for having contact with Owens Corning, and I'd be happy to reach out to the aluminum, Reynolds, Alcoa, et cetera, as well as big engineering companies. Back in the day, I worked for Bechtel, based in San Francisco, one of the biggest engineering companies in the world. And so we can imagine parallel tracks working on political solutions, media and cultural solutions, geopolitical solutions, financial solutions, real estate solutions, ocean engineering solutions, et cetera, maritime. So there's so many different fields that really need to be mastered and topics that need to be mastered for all this to come together because of the tight time frames, right? We don't have years to solve this, as Guy will be the first to say. Perhaps we literally only have months to really get a jump on this and be able to launch it with a view to implementing quickly, really quickly. So I just really want to make a strong pitch for collective intelligence. And since this group is the nucleus, thanks to the leadership of everyone on this call, including Lisa, I would vote for a weekly meeting. You know, obviously not everyone's going to be able to attend every meeting, but we can of course record it and summarize it at the end. but to build some momentum here and to have kind of a central hub from which we organize and coordinate and reach out to different groups throughout the world, as I've mentioned, then we can divide and conquer. So I just wanted to really put a strong vote for having a recurring meeting.
Any comments, Chris?
Yeah, I think
Is a weekly a good thing?
weekly or maybe bi-weekly. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe bi-weekly is probably more feasible from, but maybe we can also exchange updates by quick email on a weekly basis or a daily basis. I think a more formal meeting, 2 weeks, is probably more realistic given our busy schedules.
Yeah, of course. That sounds great. And then in addition to email, these young techies like Nolan can maybe recommend whether it's Slack, Google Docs, or some combination to also have collaborative software framework for us to work together on documents and et cetera.
So in terms of software and stuff, we also need maybe eventually websites for this, right? So getting domain names, et cetera, maybe that would be within the purview of Nolan.
Yeah, Nolan and I can work together. We've got several hundred domain names because that's one of our areas is domain name real estate. So we can take care of that. Just send us any ideas you have. We'll be happy to buy them, and but keep them for this project.
Yeah. So the current name I'm using, operating one, is a mirror reflection, because it sounds like a mirror reflection, and it's what it is. And I think in German, mir is sea, right? So it's like sea reflection. So for doing the sea, it also makes sense. Earth energy balance, I think that's a very technical term. So the actual words are also technically precise. So that's the reason why I chose it. So if you have suggestions for others, we should also consider it. But the current working acronym is mirror reflection.
MEER, reflection.
Yeah. Well, it may be that is a key component of a larger project, a larger branded initiative. But we'll have to all give that some thought.
Yeah. And I feel Lisa left one open sort of aspect, which was the why. And I feel like guys, I'm not sure if she's familiar with your presentations, but I feel like Guy sort of does frame the why, and maybe we should forward that to her just to see if that addresses that sort of open aspect of things.
We should also consider how to most tactfully, strategically present the story to a public which might not be ready for the full truth. I think now this story has the potential of being more acceptable to the general public, because we also present the dire prognosis with a workable solution. So, but of course, there needs to be some thinking about the fine details of presentation.
Well, listen, the Guy McPherson was just 2 years ago kind of a lone voice. Now he's been joined by hundreds, and the public is basically barraged every week with new information about the climate situation. And so there is a hunger for just positive vision, positive solutions. And, it's I think, very important to understand that, the psychological climate right now. And so to attract funding and support from potential partners, as Jamen was saying, I just can't emphasize enough the importance of, within a month or two, putting out some formal presentation about this. I think it really is vital to make it happen.
Are you Steve? Are you familiar with Guy's work?
A little bit, yeah.
So I'm just curious in terms of like framing what this paper is going to be. If there's a direction about what the scope needs to be, if it needs to encompass sort of his Guy's questions, or if it's just the line of temperature versus CO2, that needs to be the cornerstone of it. Maybe you can't say because you're a potential editor.
No, I mean, I think the larger framework, Guy's perspective, would be the more accessible angle. If it's more, I mean, we want both. It has to be there with I guess the two axes as well, and talk about the science, but more urgency would be the better approach.
Okay. Well,
yeah,
can be incorporated into the same presentation, I think. Right?
Okay.
And also, Ye, you hit the nail on the head. See, the world hasn't quite been ready for this urgency catastrophe conversation, because up until now, there has been no solution that anyone can point to and say, wow, we've got a solution. Thanks to us, this community here that's just starting and led by your work, Ye, we now have a solution. This is not to be underestimated. The world is now ready for Guy McPherson because we have a fire extinguisher with which we can put out Guy McPherson, right? If it was just Guy alone, and I've had Guy be a guest speaker of mine at the Sierra Club dinners. He's done an amazing job. But there are people there who basically like, what am I supposed to do? Go home and commit suicide, right? But so now that we have a solution, we need to be ready to scream that from the rooftops. And I've got experience organizing big international press conferences that blow people's mind. I mean, I'm trained as an engineer, but when I was at Microsoft, I became a specialist in marketing because that's what was needed. And so I am an expert in figuring out how to blast into people's minds. So as we get our story and our papers and our evidence and our data and the whole trajectory storyline fleshed out, let's think in terms of a press conference in Cambridge, Massachusetts, ideally at Harvard University itself, that leads Harvard scientists lead a coalition to cool the planet by 2021. And in that context, the world will be ready for Guy McPherson.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Okay. Yes. So it's all very encouraging, and so let's get back to work.
All right. Thank you.
All right, thanks for everybody, especially for Joachim. It's almost 10 or 11 in the Switzerland.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Danke, Joachim. Danke. Danke.
Gern geschehen.
It's called merci, because it's Swiss German is like more like French, but anyways.
Just as an aside, I have a paper in the September issue, this month's issue of Clinical Psychology Forum. Anybody that has access to it might want to take a look. I wouldn't get too bogged down in the grief recovery part of the show, but I use that, given that outlet, to present the importance of the aerosol masking effect. So that can take you to some of the relevant literature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, thanks.
Can you say the journal again?
Clinical Psychology Forum. It's published in the UK.
And also, in terms of, I have a quick question for Ye. Since we're recording the meeting, is this something that we will have access to, and may we share it with other groups? I'm thinking specifically other collective intelligence groups, or is there stuff here that needs to be kept confidential and therefore we can't share it?
I guess that depends on Steve. So publications in journals usually, it'd be nice to have to appear first time in the journal, I guess, in article form, right?
I mean, it's fine because I don't think we discussed much of the technical details here. I mean, if someone runs with the idea, they'd have to do all the legwork from the ground up. I think we're fine. It should be fine.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so we can share it with other collective intelligence groups that we want to bring in. Just to reinforce, my goal is that we make SRM and Cooling the Planet the initiative which brings together the different collective intelligence groups, which up until now have not had a reason to come together. Now we have a burning reason to come together. Thank you, Guy McPherson.
I guess I'm more concerned about the intellectual property, especially Ye in the crowd, than I am about publication. But maybe I'm unnecessarily concerned about intellectual property.
Well, it's usually there's no patent, no money to be made initially, of course, in this. So it's the imperative is to do the moral thing to get the ball rolling as quickly as possible. So as long as it doesn't impede publication in more formal format to also facilitate this spread of ideas, I'm open to just widely sharing.
Well, also sharing it has the advantage. This puts a timestamp on Ye presented this idea on this date in September at this time, right? So you now have precedents and a bunch of witnesses.
Okay. Yeah. Either way, I think we should just get the ball rolling.
Couldn't agree more. We've got to get the ball rolling because we are on fire and we may not have much time left. So let's get the ball rolling. Everyone, at the conclusion of this meeting, light up a cigarette, pour a cup of coffee, and think broadly, who else can I bring in to this conversation, to this collective intelligence for saving all of our lives and all of our children and grandchildren?
All right. Thanks. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks especially to Ye.
Thank you, Ye. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Great to meet you.
Yeah, likewise.
Many thanks. Be in touch.
All right.